Hey guys, this is Eric Weingartner with Weingartner Racing. Today's video is about this 383 with double hump heads getting dyno tested. I'm pretty excited about this. But anyway, before I begin to talk about this so much, here's what I need to tell you. I usually do this special once a year, and what this special is a PDF bundle. What it does is you're going to get you every single dyno test that I've done since I started YouTube. From the 406 small block Chevy, from the 427 small block Ford, from the 408 LS, the 540 big block, the 496 big block, and many others. You get all that, and the link for you to purchase that will be in the description for this video. This even has this 383 that we're talking about today. Anyway, here's something else that's great about it. This promotion goes from now till December 25th, but if during that time I dyno this again or anything else, all that data will get dropped into the box or to the data that you have. So once you purchase it, you'll be getting a link, and that link auto updates. So as I dyno test, new stuff comes out and it drops into that same file that you will have already had when you bought it. So you don't have to buy again. So any of the stuff from this year that gets dyno tested will drop in there. So if I decide to, I don't know, switch heads or something else on this engine, you're gonna get to see it. Anyway, that does cost a little bit of money because it's got over 500 dyno tests, but all that pays for future dyno testing. That's how I pay for this stuff, not from the business, or not from YouTube anyway. Anyway, so if you're interested in that, look into that. That's the special that goes from now until Christmas. And again, to purchase that, there's a link in the description for this video. Now, I'm gonna do something different from this video from here out. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna show you the dyno test first, then I'll talk about the engine. So it saves you some time. So here is the very first dyno test that was done with this engine. This dyno test right here was the very first one. This is with a 750 ATM carburetor, and it works great. As you can tell, these are the power numbers that it made. If you're probably looking at it, you're like, wow, you're really lean. I should point out something with the air-fuel ratio when you're looking at this. That's calculated. This is not from an O2 sensor. So let me explain more how this works. There's a device up above the air hat, and what it does is it's got this blades like a fan that spins, and that from that spinning the computer calculates how much airflow went through. You then have something on the fuel side that measures how much fuel flows through, and together they calculate what the air-fuel ratio should be. Upon talking to Gary, I think we found the reason why that's not entirely accurate. He had a backfire on one of the engines that he had on the dyno, and it broke the fins on the air hat. So he had to replace it. Upon replacing it, he never recalibrated it. So once the air's off, the air-fuel ratio will be off, is what you're seeing on the sheet. He does have an O2 sensor, but it doesn't record on the dyno sheet. And looking at the O2 sensor when we were running, it was between 12.8 and 13.0. So a little on the lean side, but I have to say every time we've ever dynoed that for a pump gas stuff, it makes more power that way. So anyway, that's a 750 carburetor. This is for all my truckers and people that can't see the screen right now. It made 474 horsepower at 5,900 RPM and 463 foot-pounds of torque at 4,800 RPM with this 750 carburetor. The next thing we wanted to try was this carburetor. This is my 1000 CFM race demon carburetor. It was redone by Mark Whitener. This is what we use on pretty much anything, and it's been fantastic. So put that on, hope for just a little bit more juice, and here's what it is. As you could tell, the power really doesn't look like it changed much from what you saw before. It's still in the 470 range, it's within 1 or 2. It didn't even pick up on the low speed, which this part kills me because I can already see people commenting, see, big carburetors hurt power. You do need to look at the air-fuel ratio on that one. That one is rich. There is no doubt about it, that is rich. And what I should have done is I probably should have taken some jet out all the way around, and more than likely I probably would have ended up about 5 or so horsepower better than what I had with the 750. You may ask yourself, well, why didn't you do that then? Because this is my dyno carburetor, so that jetting is always works for everything. Now, is it perfect for everything? No, but it's in general better. Usually we don't put it on something like this that makes this low of horsepower. It just doesn't make sense. Would it make more power? Yes, but it doesn't make sense to do that. So the next engine that it could be on will probably be like, for my trucker buddies again, 473 horsepower at 6,000 RPM, 460 foot-pounds of torque at 4,800 RPM. You know, something that's making over 600, so no need. By the way, before those that say, man, those 1,000 CF carburetors are too big and it's got sluggish throttle response, that is incorrect. This thing is the most snappy, and I should have recorded a session of him just flipping the throttle, because with 1,000 CFM, way more snappy than even the 750. That thing is amazing that way. Anyway, that's its dyno results. As you can tell, not bad, not bad. And the last thing was tested was this. I know you're like, what did you do? This is a 500 CFM 2-barrel carburetor. This is the reason for testing this, we'll talk about here in a minute. But really, if you're running circle track classes, a lot of you have to run that, but that's not really the reason why I did this. But anyway, that's the carburetor, and here's what its dyno results were. As you could tell, it did not make more power with the smaller carburetor. It hurt it bad, which is interesting because when you look at the how much CFM the engine was consuming, remember I told him his air thing is probably off, but even then it said it was only doing 558 CFM that was pulling in. Well, the carburetor is 500 CFM. Even at that, you wouldn't think it would lose that much, but it absolutely did, as you could tell. Because now you're down on the 530, so you're losing like at least 40. Same with the torque, is almost the same. It's just hurting it. But interesting enough, right? So cool stuff there. That was the only stuff that was tested. So now let me just... Again, for my trucker buddies, that's 428 horsepower at 5,700 RPM and 435 foot-pounds of torque at 4,800 RPM. Talk about what the engine actually is, so you won't have to ask in the comments. Okay. So now you got to see the dyno results. Here's what the engine actually is. And I'm going to tell you some background so you understand why I did what I did. So first off, the short block came from a viewer. He had bought a Smeding 383 short block. And he said, you know, I'm not doing anything with it. You want a dyno test with it? And I said, absolutely. This 383, though, is not like your normal 383. Most 383s that you see and people talk about are a 4030 bore, 3.75 stroke. That is not this. This has a aftermarket Chinese block, but it's a 4-inch bore. The stroke is a 3.8 inches. That actually yields you 382 cubic inches. So forged crank, it's also got forged rods too. The pistons are like a Speed Pro hypertetic dished piston. And thanks for the couple commenters actually pointed this out in previous videos. If you noticed, I talked about the quench. It's got 53 thousandths in quench total. That's probably more important if it was a flat top piston. It's probably less important on a dish piston because only flat spots around the outer edge. But with that dish piston and that head gasket and stuff, we have a compression ratio of 10.19. That's what it yields. Being that they're hypertetic piston, I also didn't get too aggressive on a lot of the stuff I would normally do because forged pistons obviously could take more abuse. The timing was set at 35 degrees and I never adjusted it from there. You might say, why didn't you test up or down to see if it made more power? because after the first 3 pulls, I pulled a plug. And the mark at the strap, or the timing mark, was just past the bend on the strap. And I thought, you know, it's probably about where it should be, so I shouldn't go further. I also, because if you looked at the charts, you could have jetted and I could have got a little bit more power, but again, I didn't. So anyway, set it there. The heads, now that's probably the more important part that you're really curious about. What about these 461 double humps, right? I got them for Gary at Dunsworth Machine Shop. He's where we dynoed. He does a lot of circle track stuff, and you used to be able to run double hump heads in some of the circle track classes. Pretty much in Oklahoma, if you're racing circle track, these are illegal. There are some places in Oklahoma, not in Oklahoma, but in America where they're still legal to run, but nowhere here, sadly. So he had a set and I bought them, and then I did some refresh. They were completely stock, besides he had pinned the studs. In other words, stock heads have a pressed in rocker stud, and they're known to pull out. So there's 2 options. Obviously you could pull them out, put screw in studs, or the cheaper option is to drill through them and then you put a pin in that holds them from pulling out. That's how these are, and that's how they ran. The head modification though is not what you think. So when I got them, I was like, you know, I've got a spare set of valves off of an AFR head. If you know anything about AFR stuff, they're 8mm stems. Stock 461s and small block Chevy have an 11/32 stem. It's bigger. So I was like, well, let me think what I could do. So here's what I did. I cut out the cast iron guides that are in there because they have an integrated guide that's built into these heads. I cut out that and I put in a brand new guide that makes it an 8mm stem you can run for your valve. This way I could use the AFR stuff. Not only that, I could also use the AFR valve spring kit that they have. So like the stuff that they put in their enforcer heads. And that hydraulic roller spring is good to a 600 lift. Actually, it's good a little bit more depending on how you set it up. But anyway, I wanted to switch to that. But here's the big thing. I did not make the valves bigger. Matter of fact, I made the intake valves smaller. So a stock 461 double hump head has a 194 intake valve and a 1500 exhaust valve. I wanted to try something different. I cut the intake valve to a 1.90 valve because AFR has a small block Ford Renegade head that has a 1900 intake valve. So I got that and put them in this. And you might say, why did you do that? One of the things you probably heard throughout the internet is about shrouding on the valves. Well, really that only applies to stock heads. Any aftermarket heads, they're not really shrouded. But the double humps are really, really tight to the valve. So if you make a smaller valve, it should in essence unshroud this valve or in the chamber. So this way I wouldn't have to cut the chamber to make it bigger, you know what I mean, to unshroud it. So I did that on the intake side. So I put in the AFR valve. I also, of course, redid the valve job and did some mild port work on the intake. So in other words, I just knocked out that ridge there just on the bowl. I didn't want to use a bowl hog. I just did that. I took out the little hump. If you know anything about double humps, there's a little, where these valve cover bolt holes go through, there's a hump right there, and took that out. That's it. The flow numbers. Here's the intake side. So on the intake side, stock, and it's bad. Stock, these flowed 163 at 400. And they peaked at 200 CFM, stock. I did not make them phenomenal, but I did make them better. So after all that work that I just described on the intake side, and I did not touch the chambers whatsoever, they flow 202 at 400 and peak at 228, but that's at 1-inch valve lift. At 700, they flow 221. So picked it up about 21 CFM, so pretty good gain there. The exhaust side, though, is a different story. That valve I did cut bigger. So stock is a 1.5. These are a 1.6. Cut them out to 1.6. And I did do more work on the exhaust side only because I'd already done one port. And I did, if I hadn't already done one port, I probably just would have done the bowl thing like I did with the intake. But instead, I ended up doing almost the whole thing. I didn't make it look wonderful at all. Stock, they flowed 134 at 400 valve lift and peaked at 143. They now flow 139 at 400 and peak at 200 CFM on the exhaust side. So the intake flowing 221, the exhaust is flowing 200. They're almost the same. The chambers, I did mill them down to 62 cc's. That's how I got the compression ratio we have. As far as the intake manifold, this is a stock, completely stock, AFR 4812. From my dyno testing, this intake is actually better than the Edelbrock RPM air gap at the lower RPMs for torque. Peak, it gives up a little bit, but this is probably one of the better dual planes. Ran it with the 1-inch spacer open and the carburetors you've already seen. The camshaft, this one's going to be different. So this camshaft is a hydraulic roller, but it came from our good friend and pal, Daniel Powell. He has a YouTube channel. Go check him out. Great guy. Nice to deal with 100%. He did not spec the camshaft for this. And you're like, what do you mean? He gave you the camshaft. I asked him to do something different. So let me explain why the camshaft is the way it is, because it makes a difference. Initially, when this was being tested, I wanted to see, I get so tired of LS guys running their mouth, right? And I test LSs. Obviously, I have in 408. I tested a bunch. I get so tired of them running their mouth about how superior LSs are to small block Chevys. So I was going to test, look, we're going to build a little 383, which is relatively close in size to 6.2 liter LS. Use stock heads and see how close we actually get. That was a thought. So I called Daniel Powell up and I said, hey, what's your most common camshaft you sell for the LS3 guys? And he tells me, and I said, is there any way you can make it for a small block Chevy? Now, initially, when you listen to that, it sounds easier than what it is. It is not. See, an LS has a bigger 55 millimeter cam core, and the bigger cam cores give you way more opportunities to do stuff with grinds. So he had to really do some math and figuring to get the valve vents the same for a small block Chevy one. And he did. And it cost him a little bit of expense too. So huge thanks to Daniel Powell. But don't think he spec'd this camshaft for this engine. He did what I asked him to do. This is not the most optimal for this, but it is exactly what I wanted him to do. And when future things get changed, this thing should be mint. But anyway, the cam is 232 degrees of duration on intake at 50 thousandths, 252 on exhaust, 111 lobe separation, and it was supposed to have about 560, 595 lift, but really when we measure with the rockers, if you watch other videos, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's about a 540 lift and a 560 on exhaust. Anyway, that's what it is. So there's pretty much your rundown. In case you're wondering what other stuff did you possibly have, on the dyno we use 1 3/4 headers, long tube obviously, and that's about it. There's nothing really too crazy on this. You can watch kind of the build up for this. The only surprising thing that it had for me was two real surprises. One, it had way more oil pressure than I thought it would. I used a Melling Shark 2 standard volume oil pump. I did have to weld the pickup on because I bought a Melling regular pickup and it almost slid on. So I ended up welding it on, which is, it's fine. You should probably do that anyway. But anyway, put that on there and it had a lot of oil pressure. I probably could have put the lighter spring in and maybe we could have gained some more power, but whatever. The only other thing is I really thought this would leak. I'm not joking. So when I put it together, I was like, it's going to leak out the valve cover. It's going to leak out the pan. The only spot it leaks is the oil drain plug. There's a little gasket that holds it and that sucker leaks. But other than that, pretty shocking. But anyway, that's your engine. Thanks to Daniel Powell and thanks to everybody else that helped with this. I know, oh, I need to thank Summit. They did supply the valve covers, which they work nice always. They look good. They look better if I had my logo on them. But anyway, what's the future testing for this engine? Because like, what are you gonna do now? Well, I kind of thought, of course I need some money and time. I have a tunnel ram to use for this. So I have the Edelbrock street ram. And I actually think it might be fairly decent on this. The catch is the heads don't flow much air, 220 CFM. So this intake is not the restriction. This can keep up to about 250. So putting on the tunnel ram, it doesn't really gain much airflow. It does make the runner straighter. So that'd be kind of interesting to test. The other thing is, and I have to buy a set, is a better set of rockers that actually have the rocker ratio what it's supposed to be. Those are the two things I'd like to test. But the next thing that will come up, or should come up, or I shouldn't say the next thing, but the next major thing is I'm taking off these 461s, and I have a set of these. Hopefully you're seeing the picture. This came from another viewer. These are a set of 292 turbo heads. These were considered the first aftermarket heads, although they were made by GM. And these are still made in the late 60s, early 70s. And these ones have a 202 intake valve, 1600 exhaust valve. They really outflow these 461s. They flow like 240 CFM. And I think that thing will probably break 500 when those go on. It does have a bigger chamber, so that plays a part too, so we'll see. But anyway, that's probably the next head change. That's not the only head change. We have the 492s I got to test. Those are double humps. Those are stock. And I have some open chambers I want to kind of mess with. And you're like, why? Because I want to cheat them up like we used to do on circle track stuff, where we mill them down to the same size as this as far as chambers. And they actually end up flowing. They do flow more than these anyway. And just play with that, just because I think it's fun. A couple other tests I kind of want to do, and I talked to Gary about it. Obviously, people want to test the Vortex stuff. I have a set of aftermarket Vortex heads. Some have said they might send me a set of Vortex heads anyway, stock ones. That would be interesting. But also, if you run circle track, you know they don't. Most of these are legal, double humps and Vortex, but they have their own spec head. And I did want to see, well, shoot, let's try their spec head. Problem is, those spec heads are kind of expensive. So I thought about testing that too, just for fun. I know some of the circle track guys, which are more of those than drag racers, would appreciate that. But anyway, the other thing is AFR, and you're probably going to see a live feed for me this either tonight or tomorrow morning. AFR has an enforcer head. They have an old one that they sold for a long time, and now they have a new version. If AFR would work with me, I'd probably, which they've already done this test, so I don't blame them for not doing it. They've already done this test countless times, which is dynoing the old version of their enforcer versus the new one. But I would be happy to put it on this one. If it doesn't, I totally get it, because it makes no sense from them, because they're like, we've already done it. Why would we let someone else do it again? But anyway, that's the scoop on that. That's what's going on. But I do want to talk about this. So the reason for testing it, the 2-barrel had to do with this, because a lot of you already have commented. I guarantee it. You didn't watch the whole video and probably won't even make it this far. But you probably have watched in the dyno sheet and you're like, why didn't you start the pull at a lower RPM? 4,000 RPM is worthless. In my truck, I've got to go to 3,000 RPM. You need to start the pull at 3,000 RPM. No, 3,000 RPM is completely pointless. And I'm going to explain why. This would be fine in a truck. It would be. Did I record the idle vacuum? No, I didn't. But it idled fine. Like, it could idle less than 1,000. It did. There's no problems with that. It'd be perfect in a truck and anything like that. When you talk about, I need low speed torque. Look, I have a Dodge Ram out there, or Ram, I guess that they call it now. And I've had an 83 Chevy Silverado that I had a 350 in that I would pull with too. There was never, ever a time where I was wide open throttle, in other words, foot all the way on the floor, full load, and it full load, stuck at 3,000 RPM and trying to climb that way. Never, ever happened where I had all full load as much as it could drag the engine down at 3,000 RPMs, full throttle, ever. And if you're saying that right now and you're like, I need that low speed torque, that is not how you ever operate. Because you can take your Ram, your new vehicle, your truck, whatever you got that you're using to pull now, floor it. What is the first thing it does? It kicks down and it goes to about 4,000 RPMs. Why does it do that? Because the engineers have figured out if you want the vehicle to accelerate, you'd probably want to use the most torque you have, which is about 4,000. So whether it be my Ram or my old 83 Chevy Silverado, when I'd floor it, pulling as a trailer, it'll kick down to the second gear, ramp up to 4,000 RPM where peak torque is, and go from there. That 4,000 RPM, wide open throttle, is now at full load. Hence the dyno chart things there. So I understand why you say that, but really what you're asking is, I want something that's got good part throttle torque. That's much harder to measure. So what I did was this. You got your 1,000 CFM carburetor. We'll consider that wide open throttle. 750 is about 3/4 throttle. The 500 CFM, that 2-barrel, is about half throttle. So using that, we can kind of see what it would do if you were part throttle driving, sort of. At least it gives us a better idea. That's why I did that. I don't like pulling at lower RPMs for another reason. You would think 6,000 or 6,500 RPM is the hardest thing on an engine. You are incorrect. On the dyno, the hardest thing on the engine is low RPM, full load. That's when you're going to have your greatest chance of spark knock, and the distributor is locked out. So I would have 35 degrees of timing at 3,000. I would have the hardest time is the lower RPMs, full throttle, full load. That's the hardest on the pistons, pre-ignition, everything. So why don't I pull there? Because it's pointless, one. It's just a number that you never will see unless you're in a boat. Boat's your exception. You could literally be wide open throttle at 3,000 RPM. That you could do. But for vehicles, no, you aren't. You're going to kick down. And then it's going to rev up to the higher RPM, and you can pull from there. So anyway, that's why the 500 CFM with 2 barrels used, but it also does really benefit your circle track guys. So as you see other heads getting on there, maybe we'll eventually get some, because I would like to test that. You have 2 people make the spec heads. We have the Dart and we have the EQ. And the most common question that people have asked me is which one is better, and I don't know. So that would be a good test anyway. All right, well, that's enough of me gabbing. Most of you didn't make it this far, and you asked the question that I've already said here in the comments anyway. So guys, thanks for watching. Remember, I'm no Superman. I did race Superboy. I don't port cast iron heads. The best way to reach me is my email, winegrindingracing@gmail.com. I do not respond to either Instagram or Facebook messages. You guys take care.